It's the road of all religion. There's the narrow road, the way of the gospel. It's the only true religion. Everything but the gospel is just another form of the doctrines of demons from hell. There is no salvation apart from belief in the gospel. No gospel, no salvation. You would think we would have that fairly clear by now. We are subject in this postmodern world to more contentment with a lack of clarity than any time in my life. We still have the old Roman Catholic idea of natural theology. That is to say, man has natural reasoning powers that will bring him to God without the Bible or the gospel. That's what the Catholic Church teaches. I quote the Pope's interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, quote, "Those who live in accordance with the Beatitudes and who bear lovingly the sufferings of life will enter the kingdom of God." That's Roman Catholic theology. The Protestants have a kind of version of it called the wider mercy view, and that is that God saves people by Christ, but through different religions. Some years ago, Clark Pinnock, once a Christian apologist who couldn't even convince himself, defected from the faith. And Pinnock wrote this: "God has more going on by way of redemption than what happened in first century Palestine." A little more updated version of that is Raymond Panikkar, who wrote a book called The Unknown Christ of Hinduism. Here's a quote from that book: "It is through the sacrament of Hinduism, through the message of morality and a good life, it is through Hinduism that Jesus Christ saves." Maybe more subtle and certainly more pervasive is what is currently being called the New Perspective on Paul. It's been propagated by a man by the name of N.T. Wright. You could kind of shift that a little and make it New Testament wrong, and you'd be closer to reality. But N.T. Wright has written hundreds and hundreds of pages on the gospel. And the more you read of it, the less you understand what he affirms. It is confusing, it is ambiguous, it is contradictory, it is obfuscation of the highest level, academic sleight of hand. But while I cannot figure out what it is that he does believe, even after hundreds of pages, it is crystal clear what he does not believe. More recently, he's written a book, The Day the Revolution Began. And in that book, he says this: "We have paganized our understanding of salvation, substituting the idea of God killing Jesus to satisfy his wrath for the genuinely biblical notion we are about to explore." So all of us who believe in the substitutionary death of Christ on the cross have been worshiping a paganized perversion of biblical truth, now to be clarified by him. Another quote: "That Christ died in the place of sinners is closer to the pagan idea of an angry deity being pacified by a human death than it is to anything in either Israel's scriptures or the New Testament." End quote. He's clear on what he rejects. He rejects substitutionary atonement of Christ. He rejects imputation. He rejects the gospel. He says to worship God as one who justifies through sacrifice and by imputation is nonsense. Here's a quote. If we use the language of the law court, it makes no sense whatsoever to say that the judge imputes, imparts, bequeaths, conveys, or otherwise transfers his righteousness to either the plaintiff or the defendant. Righteousness is not an object, a substance, or a gas which can be passed across the courtroom. This gives the impression of a legal transaction, a cold piece of business, almost a trick of thought performed by a God who is logical and correct, but hardly one we want to worship. Christianity Today identified him as one of the 5 most significant Christian theologians of our day. He further says, no one will be justified until he reaches heaven. One more painfully clear denial is in these words. I must stress again